Sing Street tells the story of a Dublin teenager who starts a band to have an excuse to cast a girl he likes in the music videos. They turn out to be pretty good, and his relationship with both his crush and the music he writes grows and evolves. This is from the same writer-director as Once, which I love, and Begin Again, which is fine, and this is easily more on the love side. The songs in this are genuinely great, and I really appreciated that we didn't just hear snippets of them, but we got full music videos. That final prom scene features 3 full-length songs back to back, and that was fantastic. While our female lead treads very close to the damaged cool girl tropes, the character interactions on the whole are funny and charming, even down to less central characters like the school bully or the main teen's older brother. And the movie's visuals very much contrast the realism of everyday life with the otherworldliness of the music videos, and some of those sequences work especially well in painting music as an escape from a life that feels like it's going nowhere. It ends on an ambiguous but hopeful note. I'm so glad I finally got the nudge to watch this one. The King of Comedy stars Robert De Niro as a determined but unknown comedian who has never performed live but spends a lot of time at home practicing his inevitable debut on his favorite late-night show. The film follows his increasingly disturbing plans for getting on the show after he manages to corner the host in a conversation. 2019's Joker got a lot of comparisons to this film, and well, it's obvious why. Joker is basically a King of Comedy remake crossed with Batman fanfiction. De Niro is incredibly compelling here. The scenes where he practices his interviews with his hero and tries out these different laughs on each of his jokes are both tragic and chilling. Even when he ultimately crosses the line to fully disturbing, his sense of, "I'm a good guy, I had no choice but to do this, surely they'll understand," is very unsettling to behold. The film somehow manages to combine the taut pacing of a thriller with the unhurried character development of many of Scorsese's dramas, and it's a marvelous combination. This is definitely one that I see rising to the upper echelons of my Scorsese chart. The Morning After stars Jane Fonda as an alcoholic former actress who wakes up from one of her all-too-frequent party blackouts to find herself in bed with a dead man she doesn't know. In a panic, she flees, and with the help of an unexpected companion, played by Jeff Bridges, she tries to figure out who would frame her for this man's murder and how to clear her name. This has fewer layers than Sidney Lumet's works often do, and it feels more like a standard forgettable thriller that could have been released and written by anyone. More than that, Fonda's actions are often confusing to the point of alienation, rather than encouraging us to identify with her. I frequently couldn't follow why she was doing what she was doing. And while her character's addiction and Bridges' racism are touched on as possible moments of deeper character exploration, both those elements are abruptly discarded or glossed over in the film's final act. There are a couple of really good moments scattered throughout the film's runtime, and this is overall a great story concept, but I'll bet there are better versions of it out there than this strange muddle. The River Wild stars Meryl Streep as a former rafting guide who is traveling the river again with her husband and son, and Kevin Bacon as the criminal on the run who forces her to guide him and his accomplice to a safe escape. I've never had any interest in going whitewater rafting, but this movie certainly brings out the adventure, the joy, and the excitement of it. And the landscape shots of the forests, the hills, and of course the river itself are really lovely. And when it kicks into high gear as a thriller about halfway through the movie, it does a great job keeping the tension high, with the protagonists exhausting every idea they have for how to escape their captors, so we're never left wondering, why didn't they just do this? I've said before that I rarely like Streep when she's playing a normal everyday human and find her best performances in her more extreme characters, but she's good here, coming across as both human and flawed, but also intelligent and competent. If she'd wanted to, I bet she could have continued doing thrillers because she's a great leading lady here. The side cast here is also great, and their dynamics are pretty well fleshed out. Overall, a solid watch, if not spectacular. The Secret of Roan Inish follows a young girl who is sent to live with her grandparents in an Irish fishing village after her mother dies and her father is emotionally unavailable to care for her. They tell her legends of Roan Inish, the island their whole family used to live on, and the young girl falls in love with the island and sets out with her cousin to discover its secrets. This is one of those films that just wraps you up cozily in the world it's created for you, and it's just so comfortable to stay there. I didn't expect quite as much of a fantasy vibe early on, and while I won't spoil whether the story ends on a note of realism or magical realism, it toys with both for a good chunk of the story, and that's lovely. And the cinematography on this is gorgeous. It's the kind of thing that makes you long to run away to a remote Irish village yourself, and the relationships between the characters is kind and loving despite the things that make their lives difficult. It's a sweet, charming story that I ended up liking a lot more than I first expected. Vivo is an animated kids' family film starring and featuring music by Lin-Manuel Miranda, playing the musically talented kinkajou Vivo, who works with a street performer in Cuba. The performer discovers his long-lost love and musical partner is performing her last show in Miami and is determined to meet her and give her the song he wrote for her years ago. But when he unexpectedly dies, Vivo decides to deliver the song himself, with the help of the street performer's oddball great niece. I watched this for Miranda's music, and it delivers pretty well on that level. It's got his trademark mix of show tunes, Latino rhythms, and hip-hop, and the tunes are pretty great. The story, however, is told in that classic DreamWorks style of having just too many quirky side characters that don't actually add much to the movie or have much personality, so it ends up being more awkwardly chaotic than anything else. I like the central characters, and I would easily recommend the soundtrack, and younger kids will probably not be as annoyed by the shallow filler bits as I was, but this isn't something that I feel inspired to watch again for myself anytime soon. Woodstock 99, Peace, Love, and Rage is a documentary about the attempt at a third Woodstock concert, after the great successes of the events in 1969 and 1994. This one, however, goes horribly wrong, from broken porta-potties to devastating heat to a series of riots and arsons that ultimately got the whole event shut down by law enforcement. I was only 13 when Woodstock 99 happened, and I know almost nothing about it, so I found this documentary fascinating. Some of the issues the festival had were clearly in the hands of those who prepared it. Poorly trained security and not enough water, for example, but others require the participants of this documentary to theorize. Why did so many people stay when they were having a terrible time? Why did the crowd turn violent? Some of the participants want to blame it on aggressive musical acts like Limp Bizkit and Rage Against the Machine, while others want to blame the festival creators for not having set clearer expectations of its attendees, and there are no easy or obvious answers, but everyone has a guess, and watching the footage and hearing the commentary on it side by side is so interesting. Margaret does not focus on anyone named Margaret. Instead, it's about Lisa, a teenager who finds herself dealing with a traumatic moral quandary when she witnesses the violent death of a stranger in a car accident she helped cause. She lies about the facts to protect the other person involved, but then, amid all the other happenings of her teenage life, she finds herself seriously wondering whether she did the right thing. I've appreciated and moderately enjoyed other Kenneth Lonergan films, so what happened here? What Lonergan has always excelled at is naturalistic and believable dialogue and direction, so why did this feel like dialogue right out of a Riff Trax special? Characters reiterate the same 5 points over and over again to each other, and they react to things they already know with unexpected new shock and disgust. It's not just bad, it's laughably bad, like it's been translated through Google Translate too many times, and I genuinely can't comprehend how it happened. The concept is a good one, and Allison Janney absolutely steals the one scene she's in, but the rest of it is such a bizarre stilted mess that I'm just confused as to what went wrong. A Month by the Lake follows a group of summer vacationers at a small lake resort in Italy. Vanessa Redgrave plays the returning traveler who knows this lake like the back of her hand, Edward Fox is the dashing new arrival Redgrave has her eye on, and Uma Thurman is the attractive young woman Fox has his eye on. The three go round and round, having very reserved British interactions. So the biggest problem this movie faces is that while it's tremendously easy to root for Redgrave, it's nearly impossible to root for Fox. He comes across as petulant, entitled, misogynistic, and perpetually in need of having his ego soothed. Watching Redgrave run circles around herself trying to salvage his pride is deeply painful and greatly detracts from the summer by the sea charm the movie is clearly trying to evoke. The landscape does look beautiful and relaxing, and it'd be so easy to settle into it if the movie kicked Fox's character out entirely and focused on Redgrave enjoying her time there, but for now I'd recommend A Room with a View or Enchanted April in a heartbeat over this muddled romance. Jane Eyre is, well, based on the Charlotte Bronte book of the same title. This 1996 adaptation stars Charlotte Gainsbourg as the young governess who has had to make her own way in the world, and William Hurt as the employer with a mysterious past who she falls in love with. These are two decently charismatic actors bringing the story to life, and watching their romance blossom is pretty satisfying at first. And of course, if you're a sucker for the aesthetic of 1800s Bronte Austen romances, though I am not, this is probably exactly what you're looking for. However, I don't recall the original book having such wild pacing, although maybe I'm misremembering. The film goes at an expected pace up to the big reveal of Mr. Rochester's past, and then it speeds through the last third of the story in about 15 minutes. It's extremely jarring. It makes the final scene feel not only deeply unearned, but almost absurd. It's too bad that a film willing to take its time on the romance in the first half of the story skims over the final section so haphazardly. Cyrano is the latest film take on Edmond Rostand's classic play Cyrano de Bergerac. This version is directed by Joe Wright and stars Peter Dinklage and Haley Bennett and includes songs by members of the band The National. For anyone who doesn't know the story, Cyrano is an extraordinarily witty but classically unattractive man who ends up working with an attractive but dull-witted man in his regiment to help him win over the beautiful woman they're both in love with. It's a complicated plot, but it's one of my very favorite plays, and the story gets most of it right. The leads have a really beautiful chemistry, and Dinklage is a stunning Cyrano, encompassing all at once the humor, the tragedy, and the arrogance of the character. Where it falls flat is the music. I've long held the opinion that the many attempted musical adaptations of Cyrano fall short because the original poetry is so stunning that your lyrics have to measure up, and they usually don't, and that's the case here. Cyrano is less eloquent in song than he is in prose, and the last thing you want is for your emotional stakes to go down when the music starts. It'd be a great adaptation without the songs. It's still pretty decent with. Q&A is a crime drama starring Timothy Hutton as a lawyer assigned to take depositions about a police shooting. The more he digs, though, the more he begins to worry that the shooting wasn't entirely above board. Sidney Lumet is no stranger to stories about corruption in law enforcement, having tackled it in other films previously like Serpico and Prince of the City. This time around, he draws some interesting connections between it and rampant racism, looking at how the racial tensions in the city feed into the violence of it. Like most of Lumet's crime movies, I find myself thinking at the beginning, alright, this is the one where it's going to feel like your typical crime film and I'm going to be bored, only for it to capture my interest partway through. I should really start trusting his work. There's a scene toward the end where one of our antagonists is following the protagonist without their knowledge, and I found myself genuinely tensing up as the scene played out. It ends on a less hopeful note than some of his earlier films, but it's still interesting to watch Lumet tell and retell the same story through slightly different lenses. Airheads is the story of a local rock band desperate to make it big. So desperate, in fact, that its members, played by Brendan Fraser, Steve Buscemi, and Adam Sandler, hijack a radio station at gunpoint to get their demo played on the air. This very easily could have been a terrible movie, but for the most part it works. All the different personalities in the station interact and intersect in fun ways, and while it is a wild story, it actually doesn't seem implausible or over the top, and that makes the more ridiculous moments set against this more plausible backdrop. There are, of course, plenty of good tunes in here too, as the band essentially turns their hostage situation into a mega rock concert with their favorite songs, as crowds of interested citizens gather outside the station to tune in and see what's happening. There are about 10 mini-plots running at any given time throughout this movie, so there are certainly some that work better than others. I never got much out of Michael Richards crawling around in the vents, or random people laughing at Chris Farley for being a fat police officer, but the core of this movie works, and it's a pretty good time. Censor is a horror movie focusing on a woman working at the British Board of Film Classification in the 80s, evaluating the content of video nasties, low-budget, ultra-violent horror movies being distributed on video cassette. One day, she watches a film that seems to eerily mimic her own childhood memories of her sister's disappearance, and she becomes obsessed with tracking down the filmmaker to find out if her sister is still out there. This film is deeply atmospheric, at times more atmosphere than narrative, which I find interesting to think about after watching the movie, but sometimes irritating while watching it. So much of it is told through the lead's hazy memories, dreams, and loosening grip on reality that I often found myself antsy to know whether anything I'd been watching had actually happened. When it does work, though, it works great. The final scene is utterly chilling, and made up for my frustration with the rest of the film, and lead actress Niamh Algar pretty effectively captures all the facets of her struggling character. There are people who will appreciate this more than I did, but it's probably worth checking out if you're a fan of horror. Fresh tells the story of a 12-year-old boy, Michael, who helps run drugs for a local dealer. We follow him as he impresses his bosses, tries to look out for his addict sister, and hangs out with his best friends. One of the things I find fascinating about this is how pragmatic a protagonist we have in Michael, or Fresh as he's known on the street. He's a smart, ambitious kid making a path for himself the best way he knows how. This is a potential career for him. His primary dealer boss even gives him advice on what drugs are best to sell if you want to grow old and retire with your money. I found myself most struck by his interactions with his best friend, who thinks he'd be a great runner too, and he likes to talk tough, but he doesn't have the maturity Michael does to succeed. And even though Michael clearly wants his friend to do well along with him, he knows he's going to get them both into trouble someday. It's a heartbreaking story that the writer drew on his own experiences for, and the actors playing these young kids are all capable enough to carry a challenging movie. This one's definitely worth a watch. Amityville: The Evil Escapes is a made-for-TV movie in the Amityville horror series. In this version, the house is finally cleansed of all its evil spirits, except it turns out that they mostly all just go into a lamp that gets sold at a garage sale to a family across the country in California, and then the evil plagues the family out there. I saw this as part of a Riff Tracks live event where they made a big deal out of the fact that this movie is centered around an evil lamp, and that deserved every joke it got, because yes, it is a ridiculous premise, and it plays it too straight to be anything but just ridiculous. Because of that, though, it does make for great riffing. It's taking itself so weirdly seriously, and yet being so utterly goofy, there's plenty to laugh at. It doesn't deliver on scares or depth of storytelling or anything that would make an actual good movie, but it would be plenty of fun to watch with some snarky friends. You know how you have those years when movies with identical premises come out at the same time? Well, Kate, which I just watched, is clearly Gunpowder Milkshake. Both are neon-colored movies about female assassins who have to work together with the young daughter of a previous target to take down a now corrupt organization before they die. In fact, the more I think about how to separate them out from each other, the harder it is to do so. I think Mary Elizabeth Winstead is probably the key factor for me in nudging Kate slightly ahead. She has a determined weariness that works really well for her in this film. I also really like Miko Patricia Martineau as Annie. She so naturally transforms her character's teenage angst into gleeful empowerment, and the two of them have some really great interactions. The action scenes are pretty good, the visuals are more interesting and prettier here than they were in Gunpowder, and even while the movie's ending is pretty easy to see coming, the actors pull off the emotional weight of it. It's fine. Titane is a strange, unsettling crime horror movie that is very difficult to describe the plot of. It follows a woman, Alexia, who had a steel plate put in her head after a near-fatal car accident as a child. Now she is pregnant and a serial killer, and then she changes her appearance to pass herself off as a missing boy returning to his family 10 years later. I have no idea what it is about the French cinema culture, but I nearly always feel that French dramas fly over my head, that they're doing something but that I can't grasp it at all, and that's definitely the case here. It's a very visceral movie, with several moments where I had to actually cover my eyes because the level of violence was overwhelmingly unpleasant, and I'm not a particularly squeamish viewer. There are certainly a lot of striking visual choices and memorable moments, but I'm not sure any of them are things I want to remember. I didn't come away from this film with a net positive of things I liked about it in comparison to things that I really hated. This is probably a movie that some folks will absolutely love, but definitely not me. The Card Counter stars Oscar Isaac as a professional traveling gambler, and Ty Sheridan as a young man who wants to recruit Isaac's help. The same man was responsible for both Isaac and Sheridan's father ending up at Leavenworth for several years, and Sheridan wants revenge. The two travel the country together as we, the audience, learn more about Isaac's past. This film has two separate movies in it, a poker heist movie and a movie about military trauma, and the two don't blend as well as I hoped they might. It just sort of awkwardly ping-pongs back and forth. Isaac, unsurprisingly, does a great job here, conveying the same type of controlled mystery he brings to so many of his parts. But the relationships between characters unfold in confusing ways that hold the audience at arm's length, so when the film's final resolution comes around, I can't tell where the movie's trying to go anymore. And that wouldn't necessarily be a problem, except by that point I also don't care. It's a disappointing watch that never fully feels like it gets off the ground. Knocked Up is a Judd Apatow comedy starring Seth Rogen and Katherine Heigl as a couple who find themselves expecting a baby after a drunken one-night stand. Heigl is an ambitious, organized news media reporter whose star is on the rise, and Rogen spends most of his time getting high and preparing to launch a website where you can find out in which movies and at what timestamp you can see your favorite movie stars naked. So there's a lot of uncertainty about whether they can make it work as co-parents or perhaps even partners. This movie is heavily about the characters and the dynamics of the two of them dealing with having a baby, and I really don't like either of these characters. I don't relate to them, I don't enjoy their company, I don't really care how things go for them. That being said, there are a lot of decent moments that work for me if I forget all the character setup I've been given. Take out all their character development and make this just a series of sketches where two oddly matched people are trying to navigate a pregnancy. That's pretty enjoyable, so it ends up with sort of a middle-of-the-road ranking for creating a good series of scenes centered around two people I can't stand. The Flintstones is the 1994 live-action film adaptation of the Hanna-Barbera cartoon about a world of prehistoric humans functioning in basically a modern world just powered by stone and dinosaurs. In this version of the story, incompetent worker Fred Flintstone is promoted to a high-powered executive just so he can take the fall for his boss's embezzlement scheme, and in the meantime, his promotion leads to him treating his less fortunate best friends poorly. I had extremely low expectations for this, and it's not quite as obnoxious as I anticipated. Don't get me wrong, I can't say I got anything out of it. This is clearly a movie for young children, and Elizabeth Taylor is criminally underused, but I wasn't as irritated with it as I thought I might be throughout. There are some genuine, if very simple, character arcs, and McLaughlin is always an entertaining villain, and none of the more annoying side characters were around long enough for me to resent them. It's definitely not a movie I'd recommend, but I guess it's okay that it exists, and it's fine that I've seen it. Everybody's talking about Jamie as a filmed version of a recent stage musical. It's about a teenage boy who decides he wants to be a drag queen, and has to figure out how he can authentically be himself in a school that doesn't seem too eager to accept him. This musical took the West End by storm, and became something of a cult classic, especially among young musical theater lovers. And I get why. It is deeply heartwarming to see Jamie working to find himself, especially when it's well received. And the story does a good job of placing him in the context of LGBTQ+ history. We see where his journey is easier than those who came before him, as well as how it is still a challenge. The songs in this don't immediately jump out to me as classics, but perhaps they just need some more listening. They're certainly performed well by this solid cast. I also like how the film leans into the theatricality of the musical numbers, using them to really convey a feeling more than deliver exposition. I'm not totally sold on this for myself, but I'm glad to have seen it, and I'm sure there are a lot of people for which this musical will deeply matter to them, and I think that's awesome. The Guilty is a remake of a Danish film. It stars Jake Gyllenhaal as a police officer who is working the emergency phone lines while he awaits his police brutality trial. He gets a phone call from a woman who indicates she's calling from her kidnapper's vehicle, and he takes it on himself to make sure she gets home safely. Sometimes there are those movies that just grab you from minute one and don't let go. This was one of those for me. Gyllenhaal is almost the only face we ever see in this film, and he carries it beautifully. He keeps the tension up even while most of the time we're just watching his face. It feels like a play, in the best way, in that it's so easy to get caught up with what's happening in front of you that you don't even notice how narrow the focus is. The cinematography also finds ways to keep things energetic, the dialogue is smart and well written, and does so much to show us Gyllenhaal's character and how his personal life and work life are converging. It reminded me of what I wanted Halle Berry's The Call to be, except this one actually sticks the landing. Powerful, intense, wonderful. The Deadly Affair stars James Mason as a British intelligence worker who is assigned to investigate a co-worker accused of communism. He is satisfied and intends to clear him, but that evening the man supposedly commits suicide. Mason is baffled by this and sets out to determine whether it was suicide or something more sinister. This was based on a John le Carré novel, and like most le Carré adaptations, I find it understated and dull. Even the action sequences are filmed in a very low-key, nothing-to-see-here manner, full of bureaucracy. While this is what makes le Carré's work appealing to a lot of his readers and watchers, it does nothing for me, and I had to work hard to keep caring about the mystery. Where the film does succeed for me is in the more personal side stories. Mason's wife is perpetually cheating on him, and them working through the difficulties of that relationship sustained my interest in the story more than the spy stuff. Let me clarify, that spy stuff is in fact pretty good, it just doesn't interest me that much. If it does interest you, this is probably a lesser known one worth checking out. The Harder They Fall is a western about a man chasing down the outlaws who murdered his parents and scarred him when he was just a boy. He gets all of them except one, played by Idris Elba, who is locked up for life. But when Elba gets a pardon and is released to restart his old gang, our protagonist decides to finish the job he started. This film is notable for being a Western story with an all-black lead cast, and that alone would make it something worth checking out, but it's also a tremendously stylish film. It uses its editing and music and blocking and cinematography in such creative ways that capture the attention immediately. It reminds me a bit of Tarantino's recent Westerns, but this is way better and more engaging. The story is pretty standard, but it brings some unique characters and some truly astonishing visuals into it, and it makes the whole thing pop. I think I let out an audible gasp at a few of the shots and set pieces. I'm most likely going to forget the story shortly, but I'm not going to forget how great this movie looks. Sreekaram is a Bollywood movie about a young man from a generation of farmers who decides he wants to use his educational background to help his village become agriculturally successful again, despite the many challenges and political games in his way. This is one of the less engaging Bollywood movies I've seen. I'm definitely drawn more toward the comedic films in that genre and didn't find myself connecting with any of the characters. The film feels like it's here more to convey a message than tell a story, though the message is actually a pretty interesting one, about a return to farming in a world of high-tech careers. I was also fascinated by how the second act of this film actually takes place at the beginning of the rise of COVID, but it doesn't ever become about COVID. It's just another wrinkle for the characters to deal with as they pursue their primary goals. But all that message-heavy story leaves the movie pretty dry, and the song and dance numbers aren't all that exciting to draw us back into the story. It's alright, but it's not one of my favorites.